I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I'm very happy to do so. And I would have only come for one person, and that's Dr. Prudence Carter. I will disagree just slightly that she might have cut up while we were at Stanford, but I was the model of decorum at all times. Anyone who would know me knows that that's a lie. Okay, so Latinos on the move, partisan churn, political upheaval in the 2024 presidential election. I'm going to present some data in one instance, one slide only. It's about a year old, and all the rest of the data are about a month old or less, to give you an idea of what I think is happening in the Latino electorate and how it might affect our political future. I'm going to try to highlight 3 points. The first is that there are questions regarding the changing Latino political identity, and you've certainly heard about it in the news. It is the most overreported, maybe non-story in history, but I'll show you a little bit of data on that. I'm going to put that in a historical context, talk about demographic change, and then view in terms of partisan behavior. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the Latino issue space as we go into this general election. The Latino issue space, I'll make the point, is the American issue space. It's not all that different, but with some asterisks, with some places of emphasis. It's important to go beyond issue to choice to issue focus. So when someone says they're interested in a particular national issue, that doesn't really tell you what aspect of that they're worried about. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to show you that Latino issue positions remain significantly progressive, and I'm going to talk about the special case of abortion. And then finally, the reason you're actually here, which is what to expect on November the 4th. So let's talk a little bit about history. So I know that slide's very hard to read, but you'll get the point pretty quickly. And the point is that lots of different people claim they have a knowledge of how Latinos vote. And in the same election, different pollsters and different organizations will make absolutely certain claims about Latino vote share for Democrats and Republicans, and those absolutely certain claims conflict with one another. So they can't all be true, right? And so the point I would want to share with you is that if you look at these data, you will notice that you go back into the 80s and early 90s, and customarily Democrats got about 2/3 of the Latino vote and Republicans got about 1/3. There was a couple of moments there where Democrats jumped up, and then there was a moment in the early 2000s where Republicans jumped up. But it wasn't until Barack Obama's Rainbow Coalition of 2008 and his reelection in 2012 that we saw a really significant swing of Latinos into the Democratic column. And as everyone has noted, with varying degrees of alarm or concern, that's not the case any longer. So prior to Prop 187, which was in California in 1994, the vote was 2/3, 1/3. And Latinos have a history of that oscillation, which I just shared with you. Beginning in 1996 and accepting 2000 and 2004, Democrats increased their share to over 70%. But in the last 2 elections, there's some evidence that the GOP has engaged in a bit of a resurgence. And so the question is that a regression to the mean? Is that a set of candidate-specific preferences, or is there some long-term partisan change afoot? So the underlying question, are existing voters moving toward Trump and the GOP, or are changes coming from new voters, new members of the electorate? Now, why would I ask that question? This slide details, this slide's from data less than a month old, and it asked people about their participation in this election. 23% of Latino voters will be voting in their first presidential election ever. And 14% will be voting in their second presidential election. Taken together, 37% of the Latino electorate was not in the pool of voters who selected Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in 2016. We turn over 1/3 of the electorate. Now that means a couple different things. One is that you can have change that's cohort-based without any individual changing their mind. And the second thing is that the process of political socialization and recruitment by both political parties has to be ongoing. You're never done. And the reason you're never done is because a huge percentage of the electorate will be new the next time around. If you look at party identification among Latinos by age, you'll see that the older you are as a Latino, the more likely you are to be Democrat. But I would also point out that the youngest voters are not only significantly less Democratic, they're also significantly less Republican. They are more likely to be alienated from the political system, broadly speaking, which, by the way, is a finding I could also share about African American and white young voters. So we asked this question, and I have some concerns about this question, but we asked the question, thinking about your feelings toward both political parties over the past few years, would you say that you become more open to supporting Republicans, more open to supporting Democrats, or that your views haven't changed much? Well, for about 50% of the sample, there's been no change, but the people claiming they're more open to Democrats are actually a larger share of voters than those more open to Republicans. That doesn't mean that there was no shift, but it does mean that this notion that there's this huge movement to the right seems to be belied by the data. This is the one slide I said that was going to be older. It's from a study done in November of last year. At that time, we asked people if they planned on voting for Biden or Trump. And we also asked people, when they recall 2020, did they vote for Biden or Trump? And the two things for you to notice is that in 2020, among these respondents, this is not a projection of 2020's electorate, but among these respondents, about 2/3 supported Biden and about 1/3 supported Trump. And coming into this election, when we asked them the repeat question, it's really interesting that Biden's share had gone down from 66 to 57%, but Trump's number was exactly the same. So what is happening is a real dissatisfaction, under-mobilization, under-engagement, but not necessarily a partisan switch on the part of young Democrats or young Latinos who were Democrats. We always ask this question, what do you think of the political parties? Do they care a lot about you? Do they not care too much? Or are they being actively hostile? In the study, this study conducted August of this year, 52% felt that the Democrats cared a lot, 42% said the Democrats don't care too much, and 7% said that the Democrats are actively hostile to them. By contrast, more than a quarter of Latino voters believe that the Republicans are actively hostile to them, and 27% care a lot. The plurality response on Republicans was don't care too much. So there just isn't a lot of evidence for this wholesale realignment into the Republican column, but there is a lot of evidence for erosion and lack of enthusiasm on what had previously been the Democratic side. So what about the issues coming into this election? Not surprisingly, like everybody else, Latinos care about inflation and the rising cost of living, jobs in the economy, affordable housing, and healthcare. Nationwide, those were the top 4 priorities, and all 4 of them are bread and butter priorities. Immigration, crime, gun violence, abortion, all of those things come next. They matter a lot. But when we say name up to 3 things that you're worried about, those are the top ones: inflation, jobs, affordable housing, and healthcare. Now, we dug into that to find out what people cared about, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. Who would be best at addressing your concerns? By a 18-point margin, the Democrats are preferred to the Republicans, but both Republicans and Democrats should take note that more than a quarter of the electorate think both parties or neither party are particularly interested in carrying forward on their concerns. So they're not identifying strongly on an issue basis with either party. We also then went on to ask which party speaks to your values on each of these issues. And the good news for the Democrats is that they have very strong support on most dimensions. Their weakest number is a plus 19 on small business or entrepreneurship. They're plus 23 on the American dream, plus 22 on immigration, plus 26 on public schools and education, plus 33 on democracy and elections, and plus 36 on healthcare and health insurance. So on the major national issues, the Democrats still enjoy an advantage among Latino voters. But again, about a quarter of the electorate does not see a champion in either political party. Now, we've heard a lot of talk about immigration. Have Latinos swung to the right on immigration? Well, not really. So Latinos do care about border security, and they care about border security because they have been told repeatedly that there's lots of bad things happening at the border. But that does not indicate a swing against immigrants. When we asked people to tell us Which of the following immigration concerns matter to you? The number one response was a path to citizenship for undocumented individuals brought as children, otherwise known as dreamers. A path to citizenship for long-residing, law-abiding immigrants was 45% at third, and protecting people from deportation was fourth at 41%. The only border security issue that appeared in the top four was cracking down on human smugglers and drug traffickers, which you could argue is a very human-oriented concern about border security. Traditional border security was the fifth most important issue within immigration. And this is the importance of moving beyond issue titles into understanding what the respondent means when they say they're concerned about an issue. What about some other issues? Well, 87% favor allowing Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices. 83% want a law banning price gouging. 70% want to pass a national guarantee of a right to choice. 69% support a path to citizenship for undocumented persons. 66% want to expand government health care, particularly Medicaid, to those who are documented. And 62% want to ban assault rifles. Now that's a pretty progressive policy agenda for a population who are allegedly flocking right. And finally, the special case of abortion. And Karthik's going to laugh because he's heard me talk about this before. If I hear one more time that abortion is the Republican secret weapon because Latinos are secretly super conservative about abortion because they're all Catholic, almost every clause in that sentence is false. But the most important thing is the current data. When we ask people the following question, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? No matter what my personal beliefs about abortion may be, I think it's wrong to make abortion illegal and take that choice away from everyone else. 71% of Latinos agree with the preservation of choice. 74% of Catholics, 66% of foreign-born, 56% of self-identified conservatives, 54% of self-identified Republicans, 69% of men, and 73% of women. Abortion is no one's secret weapon. Latinos are overwhelmingly pro-choice. So coming into this general election, what should you expect? The first number is the most embarrassing, and that is that as of August 23rd, 55% of the Latino electorate had not been contacted by anyone to register or turn out and vote. If you look at the National Election Study over the last 40 years or so, in every year it goes like this. Whites are the most frequently contacted, blacks are the second most frequently contacted, Latinos way below, 10 to 15 percentage points lower, and Asian Americans the least likely to be contacted by parties or candidates to turn out and vote. There's an old saying rooted in Tip O'Neill's career. He gave an interview to Chris Matthews once. He told a story about his mother's best friend. He's walking down the street and he sees his mother's best friend and he asks, I don't remember her name, let's say it was Murphy. He says, Mrs. Murphy, did you vote for me? She said, no. And he said, how could you not vote for me? You're my mother's best friend. She said, you didn't ask me to. If we're not asking entire demographics of the American electorate to turn out and vote, we cannot be angry that they don't. So that number, I think, is a pretty big one. Thinking ahead to Congress, the generic two-party ballot in congressional districts, Democrats have a 26-point advantage over the Republicans, 53 to 27. A lot of undecided, though. Looking at the Senate races, again, with a lot of undecided, the Democrats have a substantial advantage in every state except Florida, which is what we would have expected. Vice presidential candidate impact on presidential vote. This is my funnest slide, if not the most important. We did an experiment. We asked two-party vote in the following way. If the 2024 election for president was today, would you vote for Democrat Kamala Harris or Republican Donald Trump? Our results were 58.5% Harris, 32.4% Trump. When we add the vice presidential nominees in, Harris climbs to 59%, just a half a percentage point better, and Trump loses 2.5 points by the inclusion of Vance's name. I can tell you on other data I don't have in the slide, the last time we ran a favorability test on the vice presidential candidates, and remember, many people don't know them, Governor Walz was plus 18 points more favorable than unfavorable, and Senator Vance was minus 18, a 36-point favorability gap. So it has long been established in political science that vice presidential candidates do not matter to two-party vote, but maybe this one's not helping very much for one candidate. So this is what we had for presidential vote among Latino voters. We had 59% for Harris, 31% for Trump, and 10% undecided, and that was on August the 23rd. I've run a couple of polls since then. The highest I've seen is 61, and I think there's still some undecideds to shake out. The numbers will be much clearer in about 2 weeks. We looked at this among different aspects of the electorate. The only thing notable here is that 90% of Latino Democrats say they will vote for Harris. 81% of Latino Republicans say they will vote for Trump. That's really quite interesting. The other thing quite interesting is that among Cubans, the two candidates were tied, and I did not see that coming, and I don't know if we could replicate that, but anyway. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the other two panelists, and once again, thank you, Prudence, for the opportunity to be here.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here as well. So when I was asked to do this from polls to policy, it's an interesting thing for me because my primary research is not actually on polls in the electorate. However, I do think that there's a really interesting story to tell about the Black electorate in this election, and also the relationship of the Black electorate to organizing in this election as opposed to 2020. Okay, so first I want to say that the eligible voter population for the Black electorate has changed since 2020. It's increased by about 7%. That's not a very dramatic change, and doesn't equal the change in either the Hispanic or Black or Hispanic or Asian communities. But nevertheless, it also means that there's been some turnover in the electorate, new voters, new people who weren't included before. This is mostly explained by age. Age is actually really important to the Black electorate because Black young people are acting quite different than their elders. Here we see that the Black electorate is younger than the general electorate. It's a little bit more female. It's very native born, and in terms of educational attainment, it's got a majority of people, or a very close 50-50 split between people who are high school and less than high school, and then people who have some college up to postgraduate degrees. What we see here is that, as expected, Black voters vastly prefer Harris to Trump. They are Democrat identified in a way that is historically accurate since the mid 20th century. But what we also see that's a little bit troubling is that the Black electorate is less, well, troubling depending on your point of view, is less Democratic identified in 2024 than it has been previously, and less than it was in 2020. Now, I don't have data on the degree or the number of Black people who identify as independents, but if they follow the trends, particularly among the youth of the general electorate, we also see that number increasing, and particularly among the young. Okay. Here's what I want to show you about the Black electorate, and this is exit poll data from 2020, and then recent polling data from the Pew Research Center of 2024 of the shares of the Black electorate who favor the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate. Of course, Biden, Trump in 2020, and Harris, Trump in 2024. We see here that in 2020, we had 89% of Black folks cast their ballot for Biden, and only let's see, we have, yes, and only 12% cast their ballot for Trump. In 2024, we see a little bit of erosion here. This doesn't necessarily mean how people will vote, but it is how things are polling right now. And we have something like 77% versus 13%. This is with Robert Kennedy in the mix, though. That won't be the case on every state ballot, so we don't necessarily know in terms of forced choice what will happen. In other national polling data that forces a choice, at least recently that I have seen, we see about 82% of Black voters saying that they'll cast their ballot for Harris, as opposed in about the same, about 13% saying that they'll cast their ballot for Trump. So that is an interesting fact, given that we have in the 2020 electorate 87%, and then of course when Obama was running, we had about 92% of Black voters cast their votes for the Democratic candidate. Some people who sort of have analyzed this election, and I'd be interested to know, since you run the NES, what you think, that the Democrats can make up this deficit, which is admittedly a small deficit, but it's tight elections, right, close elections, with white voters, particularly white college-educated voters who are trending more Democratic. But I have not personally seen that in data that I have seen or found, so I'm actually interested in that question. Okay, this is just a battleground state poll of Black voters. Again, this is 82%, which is a very obviously broad margin, pledge to vote for Harris or say they'll vote for Harris. But again, in battleground states in 2020, that was 89%. So there's a little bit of ground to make up there for the Democratic Party. The Trump piece has also increased from about, not in the battleground states, it was about 11 or 12% in 2020, so that's holding steady. This is a similar phenomenon where there seems to be erosion among the Democratic Party, but not necessarily gains among the Republican Party, at least in battleground states among Black voters. But the story of erosion is not necessarily the case when it comes to age, okay? When it comes to age, we actually do see a swing to the right among young Black voters, and particularly young Black male voters. But this is something that is happening among young voters, period, which is something that we should think about, okay? Something that we should really think about, okay? The way that this is split is a little bit weird because it's like under 50 and over 50, and from the data that I've seen, this under 50 and over 50 splits Gen X, and Gen X is actually the most conservative living generation. Sorry, Gen Xers, to tell you that. So I think that this is a little bit of a weird split, but even so, this trend toward younger people trending more toward Trump is really interesting. What I will say about younger people trending more toward Trump is that it's not necessarily, and this slide doesn't say this is more about youth, and I'll talk about this, but it's not necessarily that younger people are more conservative in terms of issue positions as we normally sort of think about it. So it's not necessarily that younger people have become socially conservative, right? For the most part, they have not become socially conservative in terms of their issue positions. What does seem to be happening is that their most important issues are economic issues that they think that Republicans can possibly handle better than Democrats, and then also a level of disgust and disaffection, particularly among young Black voters and especially young Black male voters, something that's also reflected among young men, period. So we'll see this. So just to sort of like go sort of over this, we see that there's not only an age divide, but also a gender divide among Black likely voters, okay? This statistic has kind of blown my mind. This is the Gen X slide, so that you can be aware. This is, I'm sure that it's, in the news, everybody's heard about the growing gender gap, but when you sort of break down what that gender gap is, what it looks like, it's astonishing. It looks like young women are the most progressive people who have yet lived, right? Okay. Young men are as conservative as the previous generation, and Gen X men are very, very conservative for some reason, okay? So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you all about that. But this is a fact, right? This is a phenomena that is skewing the electorate in really interesting ways. Okay, this is about motivation to vote. Because we see in the earlier data about the Black electorate that there are still points that the Harris campaign has to make up if she's to reassemble the Biden coalition that won in 2020. Then motivation to vote really matters. We see here a kind of like mixed picture. Older people are more likely to vote. This means, obviously, as we know, but younger people have been tending to be more likely than they used to be to vote recently, and we see in this slide that young Democrats are more motivated to vote than young Republicans are. So make of that what you will. This is all, I mean, obviously, this is all recent data. This has all been collected, or at least released in August. Here's something that I think is really interesting. What we see also as evidence of the disaffection of the entire electorate, but especially among the young, and this might be a little bit hard to read, but the desire for a third party, someone other than the Democrats and the Republicans to cast a vote for. This is a desire that's shared across the electorate, but is particularly pronounced among younger generations. And if you talk to young people, if you interview them, I don't do focus groups, but if you interview them, this is sort of one of the things that rises to the sort of top of the topic of conversation very, very fast, right? I wish I had a different choice. Why can't we have a different choice? This was particularly pronounced when it was a Biden-Trump a contest, but even with a Harris-Trump contest, we have this sentiment. And this is a sentiment that's from across the sort of ideological spectrum. I personally interview young activists quite often. They are very frustrated with their choice right now, and are very frustrated with the structural impediments to having multiple parties in the American system. I know this is super hard to read, but this is just top priorities, okay, of folks in the electorate. Sort of what you'll see here is that strengthening the economy is a top issue for almost everybody, but then the issue positions kind of break down as to what people prefer the most among Black Americans. Education and Social Security are as important as the economy in terms of issues they're interested about, education and healthcare costs, right? Then we also have attention to dealing with poor people. This is also something I find in the data in terms of people who are concerned. Black people are more concerned about poverty than other demographics. And this rises to the top in terms of issues of concern in the demographics. We see this also among Black young people, and I'll show you this slide, the next slide as well. Reducing crime is also another thing that Black people are concerned about. And addressing issues around race. I will say that I think the reducing crime, preference and narrative, which is consistent across studies, is similar to the border security, the way that you characterize the border security preference among Latino voters, in that Black people can be very, or African Americans can be very concerned about reducing crime in ways that are interpersonal. But I think that interpersonal sort of like there's crime in my neighborhood angle is actually overplayed. A lot of it is about salience of crime, and Black people also know that when crime is salient, their lives are harder. So that's another reason for crime to be salient among Black respondents beyond a kind of personal experience with it. Okay. This is a chart from Gen Forward, which is Kathy Cohen's polling outfit that surveys young people, generally speaking, with oversamples of young people of color. Here we have their issue preferences, or the issues that they designate as the most important issues facing people like them. They're kind of all over the map and all over the board. But I will note across demographics, that the top issue is housing affordability. right? So this is a way to sort of like break down the notion of the economy. I absolutely agree with Professor Segura that breaking down what people mean by the economy is extremely important because people mean different things, right? So when the economy is the top issue, when a young person says the economy is the top issue, apparently what they mean is housing affordability, right? It's not necessarily unemployment, which another group might mean. It's not necessarily even inflation, right, which another group might mean. So that's also important to know. We see here that there are some divergences among young people about how they identify other things as important to them. Among the Black electorate, we see that there is, again, this concern with crime that outweighs other young people's concern with this issue, as well as a concern with gun violence that's more prevalent than other groups, more prevalent than in other groups. Okay. Oh, did I have this twice? Okay. Okay. I thought there was one more, but I guess there is not. Well, in any case, one last thing that I wanted to say that I don't have a slide to talk about is the relationship between organizing and social movements in the Black electorate at this time. We see that the Black electorate is not as, at least not yet, as solidly conformed around the Democratic Party as it was during the 2020 election. That's in part because of erosion of Democratic support, particularly among the young, and particularly among young men. The thing that we should also note is that a lot of the organizing that made the 2020 coalition possible in terms of shoring up support among Black voters was the result of a very large social movement that took place during that election year, particularly in certain battleground states, notably Georgia. Georgia this year is going to be a really, really hard fight for Democrats, not only because of it's going to be a hard fight everywhere for everyone, but also because the organizing apparatus that existed there to deliver 2020 has been dismantled over the past 4 years. And this has also been the case in terms of organizing apparati across the country. State policy and policymakers have become more and more hostile to protest and protesters and have made it harder for them to do the work of organizing. Now, most of the time, people who are organizing for a cause other than electoral politics, but we saw in 2020 that when electoral decision makers are friendly to protesters, they also receive a benefit from that at the ballot box, not only in terms of direct organizing, meaning that there's always sort of like a branch or a person who is interested in registering voters. We saw a measurable impact for increases in voter registration, especially Black voter registration that happened literally at protests and in protest, right, during 2020. But also from areas where people protested from the protests themselves. So for example, there's a wonderful recent paper that appeared in Mobilization that showed that in localities where there were Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, Democrats got a higher percentage of the vote. It increased Democrats' share of the vote by 2 or 3 percentage points in areas where protests took place. So the crackdown on organizing since 2020, I think will have detrimental effects for the connection that it had with electoral organizing. There's also the generalized disaffection that I was talking about before that you hear from people in interviews who dedicated a lot of time to electoral organizing in 2020 but don't feel that it has paid off. This is particularly among the young, particularly among organizers and activists. And there's a pretty fungible line between organizers and activists and protests and those who also end up being party activists, right? In terms of like the exit, voice, and loyalty folks, right? The voice people tend to have organized across several different things. And so we do have a deficit there. So in terms of what to expect November 5th, I don't know, right? I can't tell you that. But I will say that the coalition assembled in 2020 might be slightly different. And things to watch is definitely what's happening with the youngest part of the electorate. There might not be a realignment that's happening with the rest of the electorate, but I think there's definitely a realignment that's happening there. It's not necessarily one that has a very simple story. That is, you can't just say like young people are swinging to the right. It doesn't seem that they're actually swinging to the right. It seems that disaffection, frustration, despair, and disengagement are resulting in people making some different kinds of choices than we would have expected. And also the kind of baseline normalization of the two-party system, two-party first past the post, winner-take-all system is not necessarily one that they are identifying as something that's worth keeping going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm hearing some consistent themes and words like erosion and realignment or potential realignment. So I think there's a lot of fodder here for discussion. Before I go into data and insights about the Asian American and Pacific Islander electorate, I want to start with a personal note of thanks and just a little bit about my journey. So I did graduate Brown 96. And I come from a family of people who went to Brown. My older brother was 93. My younger brother was 98. So this is the first time I've been back on campus in a meaningful way, meaning like when I came with my family as a tourist, as it were, 12 years ago. But it's been over 25 years, and it's kind of a trip. You know, I took a religious studies class in this building. I lived in Emory-Woolley my freshman year. So it's bringing back a flood of good memories, but a flood of memories nonetheless. And so I'll say a little bit about my journey as a publicly engaged scholar, and to where we are today in terms of the work we do at API Data. So I started off as a religious studies major, and then over time decided I was more interested in religious nationalism and the politics of religion. So then I ended up finishing in political science. I did go to Princeton for grad school. Prudence, I hope you'll forgive me for that. And when I graduated, I knew that I wanted to have larger public impact than just having a dozen or 24 scholars reading one's work and citing it. I think for a lot of scholars in race and ethnicity, we have audiences that go well beyond that. But I still remember this moment as someone going on the job market, over-prepared, so excited to present my job market paper, not paying attention to the fact that it was a Thursday 8 a.m. panel, but still showing up and seeing 4 people in the audience. And I thought, this is not the way I want to make impact in the world. And the topic of study, it was immigrant political activism and mobilization, voting, even then was of public importance. And to not have that work recognized, have impact in how the public, political institutions, and others perceive these issues, to me seemed like a major missed opportunity. So my first job after grad school was actually to work at a think tank, the Public Policy Institute of California. I did that for 3 years. I was already on that journey of being a publicly engaged researcher. And PPIC gave me the skills to hone that practice even more. And then I left to help start a school of public policy at UCR, thinking that I would create a kind of think tank in Southern California. Turns out the academy sometimes is and isn't always conducive to public engagement. People are trying, and people are trying to change systems from within, but it's still a journey. So I say all of that to get to API Data. So I started API Data in 2013. It was after being a PI on 2 national surveys of Asian Americans in 2008 and 2012. And typically what we found was that there was a lot of media interest in Asian Americans, and it would peak around September, October of a presidential election year, and then it would crash after November. No one cared about Asian Americans anymore. But at least they cared, and we got news coverage in 2008, and we were inspired by Gary and colleagues at the Latino National Survey terms of social science insights producing, social science research producing insights that are part of public conversation and public understanding. And yet it was disappointing, right, to see that people didn't care as much anymore after Election Day. But what happened in 2012 and after 2012 was different, partly due to the Pew Research Center's study in 2012, which had a lot of important insights, but it was a little bit of a dumpster fire, if you will, in terms of really problematic framing, model minority framing around Asian Americans. I was part of the advisory panel, and we were caught blindsided by how the Pew Research Center publicized that work and framed up that work. I was hoping that there would be a Pew Asian American Research Center the way that there was a Pew Hispanic Research Center, but it was not to be. By the way, the Pew Research Center now, and with Neil Ruiz, has really rebuilt, done a lot of healing work and rebuilding trust with the community, and the Pew Research Center's Asian American research now is really strong. But for about a decade, they had generated enough news media interest in Asian Americans, and it created an opportunity for API data to start informing news coverage. And for me, that moment came after the 2012 election when a reporter for The Economist called me and wanted to know about the Vietnamese American community in Orange County. And I was like, wow, oh, you care about this community? It's out, check the calendars after Election Day and we're still talking about this? And I realized that there's a lot there that can be done in terms of educating reporters who are on very tight deadlines, don't know enough about the community, and to offer resources that can help provide important context for responsible reporting on the issue. And so that's how API Data was born. It started off as a very simple website. And for the longest time, it was just me and a graduate student researcher at UC Riverside. That changed during the pandemic and after the increase in hate incidents, including hate crimes and violent incidents against Asian Americans. And especially after the mass killings in Atlanta. And again, this is a sad story for communities of color. People don't care about our communities until they get killed in either tragic or unjustifiable ways. For Latinos, they're getting killed all the time, and there's not that seminal moment for people to realize we have to invest in understanding these communities. But thanks part to that is that we've been able to increase our staff and have a stronger presence, so much so that we don't ever call ourselves a think tank for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but I think in effect we are. We are changing the national conversation. A lot of it based on survey data, but there's other kinds of research that we also do. We produce reports. We also create data tools to democratize access to data that you don't need to have statistical software or understanding to gain insights about our community. And our work is not possible without partnerships. By the way, you'll see in our tagline is a framework that I developed a few years ago at the Center for Social Innovation at UCR that I started, because people used to always look to me and to API Data as like, oh, you're the data guy, right? And my friend Richard Louie at MSNBC started calling me Dr. Data. And I was like, I don't want you to look at me as just data. Like I have a brain too. Like there's some insights that are coming here. But also the work that we do go beyond data. And so the work that we do and the kind of very simple frame here is DNA, which is data, narrative, action. And we do that in nonprofit leader training. We do that in training academics as well. One, of course, data and research is important for credibility, but data in and of itself is not meaningful, nor is it memorable. And our community partnerships are essential to have that narrative underpinning, to have responsible reporting on our communities. And then finally, we don't want to just have solid data and beautiful narrative as something to marvel at. We want to change the world, right? And that's what action is about. And so we focus on all three in terms of the kind of impact we want to make. So we're 7 people now at API Data. And just recently, I moved the shop to UC Berkeley, and we're at the Asian American Research Center. terms of the election, we have several resources now. We actually now have a proliferation of data, and part of the challenge is when you're swimming in so much information, how do you help people pull it all together and make sense of it? So a lot of journalists end up using these resources, including where Asian American and NHPI voters can make the difference, right? And, every group has its sense of pride thinking they're going to be the ones that deliver the election, and especially so for Asian Americans. And sometimes I have to remind my colleagues, we are a smaller population than other groups, including Latinos and Black voters. And in fact, when you look at states like Georgia, where the Asian American vote played a critical role in 2020, both presidential and the special Senate races, it was built on high Black turnout, right? So if you're putting these foundational bricks on what it takes to tip elections in a more progressive direction, you almost can't do it without high Black turnout. And for most people, I think most people now either realize or come to the understanding that Obama's election, of course, was a multiracial election. It was by no means post-racial, but Black turnout was the bedrock on which Obama won in 2008 and 2012. And that remains true. And whenever Democrats lose, lower than anticipated Black turnout, or maybe not running up margins as high, is a critical part of that story. So I think it's important to understand that context to then figure out where Latino and Asian American electorates play a role. That is definitely an important piece of the puzzle to keep in mind. I'm also really proud to be in a position, I'll go back here a second. So, think back to 2008, we did a national survey of Asian Americans. 2012, we did it for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So doing surveys every 4 years. And then we started doing it every 2 years for every midterm election and presidential election. One of my proudest moments was last year when we inked a partnership with the Associated Press and NORC at the University of Chicago to do a bi-monthly survey of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. It is very expensive to survey Asian Americans, and largely because of language needs, but also because you need to have large enough samples of at least the largest 6 Asian American groups to be able to say something meaningful beyond just that generic Asian category. So typically it costs at least $1 million to be able to pull off a survey. But through NORC, API Data was one of the investors in a panel, along with AARP and others, so that researchers, including many of you in the room here, can do surveys, about 15 questions for $30,000 to $40,000. So the economy of scale has improved tremendously here. We've invested significantly in the Amplify AAPI panel run by NORC, and it's built in large part on the Pew Research Center's address-based sampling method. So if you're interested, I'm happy to talk to you about it more. I'm on the advisory panel for Amplify AAPI. We also believe in the importance of demographic data, and this is something that we built with Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities in mind, but we also have data for Latino communities, American Indian communities, Black communities, and white communities. So essentially it takes the American Community Survey, and if you want to understand, for example, there's a reporter who's doing work in Nevada and wants to know about the Filipino community in Nevada. I just told him to go check out our Data Explorer. You can choose the state of Nevada, and you want to know what poverty looks like, what homeownership looks like, what overcrowded housing looks like for the Filipino population in Nevada. You can get that data. So I would encourage you to test it out, and if there's anything missing or anything we could improve upon, please let me know. And we have, through community feedback, improved on it. One powerful moment was at a national community town hall where we presented this, and a couple of members of the community came up and used an app, and they were hard of hearing, right? They were hearing impaired, and said, you have disability data in the ACS, why don't you put those indicators up? And I said, absolutely, thank you for pointing that out. And so we have disability data up on there. And there are a couple of other examples where we've improved our data tools based on community feedback. I'll say briefly about the election and then look forward to the conversation. So this is data that we released yesterday. So September 24th, 2024. And what we saw, some of the key findings, is an energized electorate. So what Gary talks about erosion, we saw that as well between 2020 and 2024, that Biden had lost a lot of support among Asian Americans, and in particular among Asian Indians, for example. But it wasn't like they were moving over to Trump. They were on the sidelines and likely frustrated with the choices before them, and likely frustrated with Biden. But it also showed up in Kamala Harris's relatively low favorability ratings as well compared to 2024. So when I was talking to reporters from the first survey that we did before Biden dropped out, it seemed an open question in terms of what was going to happen to the Asian American vote. But with the results that we released yesterday, we saw a significant increase. Well, first, let me talk about the intention to vote, and then I'll talk about vote choice. But the intention to vote, first of all, it didn't look like Asian Americans were particularly enthusiastic about this election. And now 77% say that they're absolutely certain that they will vote, just a few percentage points below what it was in 2020. And 2020 was a record year for Asian American turnout. So it looks like we're heading into that kind of an election again. Still ways to go among younger voters who don't seem as convinced that they need to be voting. And you see the partisan differences there where Democrats are really, you see a huge shift, right, in terms of the intention to vote. In terms of contact by parties and other groups, Asian Americans and Latinos are the least likely to get contacted, right? And we see that in the ANES data. I will say ANES does not have language support beyond Spanish, whereas our surveys and others like Pew's do, except it was interesting. The Pew data, and I'm glad they do this, whenever they have Asian that they don't have language support, they put an asterisk, which I think is good, and truth in advertising, right? That it's representative of the English-speaking Asian American population, but we found differences when you do in language. So the good news is that contact by parties has gone up between April, May, and September, but it's still below where it should be. So in April and May, 42% said that they had not been contacted by either party, and that's down to about a quarter of the electorate now. And there still is a gap between those who have been contacted by the Democratic Party as opposed to those who have been contacted by the Republican Party. But still, 62%, right? It's nowhere near 80% or 90%. We also had some questions about concerns about the November election, and I think this is something that we and our community partners are tracking. And this will be familiar to many of you because it's not necessarily about what would be concerns for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The biggest concern is fake or false information about the candidates, followed by violence after the election. I mean, this is America 2024, that we have to worry about this. Legal challenges to the election. Threat of violence at the polls, the concern is not as high as it is for other groups, but it's still disturbingly high. Voter fraud at the polls. And this, by the way, it's much higher among Republican identified than among Democrat or independent. Not having my vote counted, fake or false information about where to vote, and then being prevented from voting. So, some of those are significantly lower than misinformation and violence. In terms of presidential vote choice, Harris has done it, right? So you saw that 46% said that they intend to vote for Biden, and Harris has increased that by nearly 20 percentage points. It's a huge jump. Indian Americans, Harris is getting at slightly higher support than Biden did in our pre-election survey, and you see some major movement among Filipinos as well, who are an important constituency in Nevada. For Trump, we see slight decline, but it's within the survey's margin of error. So it is essentially this story of voters that were sitting on the sidelines and now feel like they have a meaningful role to play. But as I think for all of us, when we're asked to predict what's going to happen in November or forecast, I don't know. We've been through enough nail biters to know that no matter what the polls say, that we need to be humble in terms of what will likely pan out on election day. Candidate favorability, Vance is not happening. Vance is not helping the Republican ticket much. We did not ask about Usha Vance's favorability rating. It felt like she had about 3 days in the limelight before Biden dropped out and Harris came in, and it's largely been a non-story. Yeah, not only do vice presidents not matter much, spouses of vice presidents, unlikely that they're going to make much of a difference. One thing we're paying attention to is Republican support among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and that's something we've seen in the past. And that's something as a community serving and kind of community partnered organization, it's something we have to think about. And for the way it's been told to us with our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander partners is that the issue of abortion and religious institutions do play a significant role. And the Democratic Party is not recruiting in the evangelical churches where NHPIs have significant membership and engagement and participation. But Harris and Walz are, have high favorability ratings and high net favorability ratings. In the work that we're doing with Associated Press and NORC, largely we try to mirror questions that we ask of the general population to be able to provide a comparison. But I've been pushing the team to also innovate on questions that I think are important to ask. But sometimes with a small population, you can ask new questions and then try to change how general polling would ask that question. So one of the things I've always thought about is is there a way to figure out, is there an issue that someone cares about so much that they will withhold support for someone? And we see that potentially with Israel-Gaza, right? That I care so much about this issue, I'm going to protest and I'm not going to vote. But how do you ask that question in a survey context? I'm not saying that this is the only way or the best way to do it, but this is the way we did it a few months ago, and we repeated the question. And the question wording is it possible you could ever vote for a candidate who does not share your views on each of the following? Or is this issue so important that you could not ever vote for a candidate who disagrees with you? It's a little complicated. I think this word could be simplified, but let's just go with it. What was surprising a few months ago, and it's not surprising to me now, is that racism and discrimination is number one. Now, people might say, well, isn't that already kind of baked in? Who Donald Trump is, right? So how can this be your single vote issue or your litmus test issue? But what it tells me is that no matter how much people may be dissatisfied with the Biden administration or have significant concerns about the economy, first of all, partisanship, that was the story in 2022, and abortion. Those were the two things. That's what basically saved the Democratic Party from a red wave in 2022. But not many people are talking about racism. So all of this talk about Springfield, Ohio, all of the racist, not just dog whistles, but bullhorns that Trump and Vance are engaging in, it is going to hurt them. Because they probably could persuade people who care enough about some of these other issues or just sour on the incumbent party to vote for the Republican ticket. But that's going to be a barrier for a lot of people. Crime and violence and gun policy round out the top issues. Israel-Gaza is at the bottom of the list, right? So, of course, it can make a difference at the margins where you have Asian Americans in significant numbers, say in states like Michigan, for example, where there's a significant Arab American population as well. But it's not going to be the driving issue the way that abortion and racism, right here we are at the Center for the Study of Race, right? That is, even though it's baked in, it's an important dynamic in how this election is going to play out. Finally, last surprising finding, there's been so much talk about Harris's race as a Black person, as an Indian. As the former president said, that she happened to become Black. I don't even know what that means. But race has been talked about so much that we thought that in terms of Kamala Harris's identity, that her racial identity, either as an African American or as an Asian Indian or South Asian, would play a significant and meaningful role in how voters think of her. But what we found was that her identity as a woman was much bigger than her racial identities. And that's something that people have been talking about, how gender is below the radar this year compared to 2016, where Hillary Clinton, the campaign itself made it a big deal, and that was seen as the biggest factor, both heading into Election Day and what hurt Hillary Clinton. Gender matters, but it's under the radar. Part of it is through abortion and reproductive politics, but part of it goes beyond that. And it's fascinating to see. By the way, I'm just presenting some breakouts. I don't want to just repeat a whole bunch of slides, but you see that this is especially prominent among younger AAPI voters and also among women. And in fact, when you look at the Harris voting numbers for the first time ever, and I think we are going to see significant gender gaps among Black voters, Latinos, and Asians in ways we have not seen before. But it's not necessarily the Trump male effect when it comes to Asian Americans. It's the Harris female draw that you're going to see, that over-indexing on Harris. That's probably going to make a difference if she is indeed our next president. So thank you so much for your time and look forward to the conversation.